You've been taught your entire life that Jesus was unique, singular, the only Son of God. But what if I told you that's not the complete story? What if I told you there was another figure walking beside him, teaching the same mysteries, performing the same miracles, and that this person was systematically erased from history by those who feared what he represented? Before we dive into one of the most controversial and hidden truths in spiritual history, I want to know, what time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching this from? I'm asking because this message is reaching souls across the entire planet at different moments, and there's something profound about that. The fact that right now, in this very moment, you're being called to hear this truth. Whether it's early morning and you're just waking up to this revelation, or it's late at night and you can't sleep because your soul is hungry for something deeper. You're here for a reason. The universe, your higher self, your soul has guided you to this exact moment because you're ready to know what's been hidden from you. So drop a comment below. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is, because we're about to shatter some of the deepest programming that's been embedded in collective consciousness for over 2,000 years. Let me take you back to the very beginning. Not the beginning you learned in Sunday school or religious education, but the real beginning that's been buried in ancient texts, whispered about in esoteric circles, and carefully erased by religious authorities who understood that this knowledge would completely dismantle their power structures. We're talking about Thomas, but not just any Thomas. We're talking about Didymus Judas Thomas, whose very name means the twin. Now here's where it gets absolutely fascinating, and where the cover-up becomes so obvious, it's almost laughable once you see it. In Aramaic, the language Jesus actually spoke, Thomas isn't even a name. It's a title. Toma means twin, and Didymus? That's Greek. And it also means twin. So this man's name is literally Judas the Twin, or Twin Judas. The translators and scribes who came after were so desperate to obscure this connection that they kept the redundancy right there in plain sight, hoping no one would ask the obvious question. Twin of who? Because here's what they don't want you to realize. Thomas was called the twin because he was Jesus' twin brother, possibly even his identical twin. And the implications of this are so revolutionary, so consciousness-shattering, that the early church fathers had to systematically erase, rewrite, and destroy every text that made this connection too obvious. You see, if Jesus had a twin brother who walked the same path, who taught the same mysteries, who accessed the same divine consciousness, then suddenly Jesus isn't this unreachable, singular deity that only we can connect you to through our religious institution. Suddenly, the Christ consciousness becomes something available, something human, something that runs in families, in bloodlines, in DNA. Something that means you have access to it too. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the most profound and earliest collections of Jesus' teachings, was discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and this wasn't some accidental find. This was the universe timing a revelation for when humanity was finally ready to begin questioning the narratives we'd been fed. This gospel, which many scholars believe may actually predate the canonical Gospels, doesn't focus on Jesus' death and resurrection like the church wanted. Instead, it focuses on his teachings about the kingdom of heaven being within you, about you already possessing divine nature, about awakening to your true self. And who supposedly compiled these teachings? Thomas, the twin. The one who understood Jesus not as some distant God, but as a brother, as someone who showed him that the same consciousness flowing through Jesus was flowing through him too. The very first line of this gospel says, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." And right there in the opening, We see the emphasis on secret teachings, on hidden knowledge, on things that weren't meant for the masses, but for those ready to awaken. And what does Jesus say in this gospel? If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. This isn't worship me theology. This is wake up theology. This is you have the same power I have spirituality. And the church couldn't have that. They needed you dependent. They needed you believing that salvation came through them, through their priests and rituals and confessions and tithes. But let's go deeper into the historical evidence that's been sitting right under our noses this entire time. In the Syrian Christian tradition, which is one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions and far less influenced by Roman ecclesiastical editing, Thomas isn't just an apostle. He's revered as the apostle who brought Christianity to India. And in these traditions, the connection between Thomas and Jesus as twins or twin souls is openly discussed. The Acts of Thomas, an early Christian text that was widely read until the church decided it was too heretical, explicitly refers to Thomas as Jesus' twin brother, and even includes a scene where Thomas is mistaken for Jesus because they look so identical. Let that sink in for a moment. There are ancient texts where people literally cannot tell them apart physically. The church fathers read these texts, knew about these texts, and made the conscious decision to exclude them from the biblical canon precisely because they revealed this twin connection. In one account, a king's daughter sees Thomas and believes Jesus himself has come to her wedding, and Thomas has to explain that he's not Jesus but his twin brother. Why would this be threatening? Because if Jesus and Thomas were twins, if they were that similar in appearance, in teaching, in consciousness, then the divine nature wasn't unique to one person. It was shared, it was human, it was accessible. Now I want you to really sit with something for a moment, because this is where the spiritual ramifications become absolutely profound. What if the reason Thomas is called Doubting Thomas in the canonical Gospels is not because he doubted the resurrection, but because he doubted the story being created around Jesus? What if Thomas understood, better than anyone, that his twin brother had achieved a level of consciousness, a state of awakening that wasn't about worshiping him as God, but about following his example and awakening yourself? The famous doubting scene where Thomas needs to touch Jesus' wounds. What if that's been completely misinterpreted? What if Thomas wasn't doubting that Jesus was alive, but was confirming something else entirely? That the resurrection wasn't about a physical body coming back to life, but about consciousness transcending physical death, about the real you, the eternal you, being beyond the body. And because Thomas was his twin, because they shared this deep soul connection, possibly even the same DNA, Thomas would have been the one person who could truly understand what Jesus had accomplished at a consciousness level. The church turned this profound understanding into doubt, because doubt makes Thomas lesser. Doubt makes him the weak one who needed proof. Doubt makes him wrong and the church authorities right. But what if Thomas wasn't doubting at all? What if he was the only one who truly understood? And that understanding was so dangerous to the power structure being built that they had to reframe his role entirely. Let's talk about the Gospel of John for a moment, because even in the edited, church-approved version, there are traces of this twin mystery that the editors couldn't completely erase. John 11 verse 16 says, "Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'" Now on the surface, this seems like loyalty, but look deeper. Thomas is saying, let us die with him. Not let us save him, not let us stop him, but let us die with him. What if Thomas understood something about death that the others didn't? What if he knew that death wasn't an ending, but a transformation? A shedding of one level of consciousness for another. And what if this understanding came from deep mystical teachings that he and Jesus had learned together, perhaps from the lost years that the Bible conveniently skips over? You know what I'm talking about. Jesus disappears from the biblical narrative around age 12 and doesn't show up again until he's 30 years old, starting his ministry. 18 years are completely unaccounted for. Where did he go? What was he learning? And more importantly, was Thomas with him? There's a tradition, especially strong in India and Tibet, that Jesus traveled to the East during those lost years, studying with Buddhist masters, learning meditation, exploring the nature of consciousness, and understanding the eternal nature of the soul that transcends death and rebirth. The Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, India, claims to have ancient texts describing Saint Isa, which is Jesus, studying there as a young man. And here's where it gets really interesting. What if Thomas was with him? What if the twins traveled together, learning together, awakening together? This would explain why Thomas later went to India to spread these teachings. He wasn't bringing a foreign religion. He was returning to a place he'd already been, to people who already knew him. The Indian Christian tradition holds that Thomas arrived on the Malabar coast in 52 CE and established 7 churches. And these communities have maintained teachings that are distinctly different from Roman Christianity. Teachings that emphasize personal direct experience of the divine, meditation practices, and inner awakening. Sound familiar? Sound like Buddhism? Sound like what Jesus might have learned if he'd spent years studying in the East? But here's where the conspiracy, and yes, I'm calling it a conspiracy, gets even darker and more deliberate. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea was convened by Emperor Constantine. And this is where Christianity, as we know it, was essentially created as a political tool. Constantine wasn't interested in spiritual truth. He was interested in unity, in controlling a fractious empire through a unified religion. The bishops and church fathers who gathered at Nicaea made decisions about which texts would be included in the Bible and which would be excluded. And their criteria wasn't which texts are most authentic or which texts contain the real teachings. Their criteria was which texts support the power structure we're building. Any text that suggested humans could achieve Christ consciousness themselves, any text that made Jesus too human or too accessible, any text that distributed spiritual authority to the individual rather than centralizing it in the church. Those texts were out. The Gospel of Thomas? Too empowering. The Acts of Thomas? Too revealing about the twin connection. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene? Too much feminine divine energy, and too much suggestion that Mary was Jesus' partner and equal. The Gospel of Judas? Too much suggestion that Judas was following Jesus' instructions rather than betraying him. Text after text after text was systematically excluded, and not just excluded, many were ordered to be destroyed. Possessing these texts became heresy punishable by death. Let me tell you what they were really afraid of, because once you see it, you can never unsee it. They were afraid that if people knew Jesus had a twin brother who was just as awakened, just as connected to divine consciousness, just as capable of teaching and healing and transforming lives, then people would realize that this consciousness wasn't unique. It wasn't reserved for one special person born 2,000 years ago. It was available. It was in your DNA. It was in your soul. It was your birthright. And if people realized that, if people understood that the kingdom of heaven is within them, just like Jesus taught in the Gospel of Thomas, then what would they need the church for? What would they need the priests for? The rituals? The guilt? The confession? The control? The entire power structure would crumble because people would realize they have direct access to the divine. that they don't need an intermediary, that they are themselves expressions of the same consciousness that flowed through Jesus, through Thomas, through Buddha, through every awakened master who's ever walked this earth. Now let's talk about something that's going to blow your mind even further. The concept of twin souls and twin flames in spiritual teaching. There's a reason this archetype appears across every mystical tradition. The divine masculine and feminine, the sun and moon, Shiva and Shakti, yin and yang, the twin serpents of the caduceus. What if Jesus and Thomas represented this same archetypal energy? Not necessarily romantic twins, but soul twins, two expressions of the same consciousness coming into physical form to demonstrate something profound about the nature of reality and awakening? In Gnostic Christianity, which was viciously suppressed by the Orthodox Church, there's this concept of the syzygy, which is a divine pairing, a twinness at the soul level that represents completion and wholeness. What if Jesus and Thomas were demonstrating this principle? What if their twinness wasn't just biological but cosmological, showing us that awakening isn't about becoming singular and separate, but about recognizing the divine partnerships and connections that exist at every level of reality? Let me take you even deeper into the esoteric meaning of all of this, because we're not just talking about historical cover-up. We're talking about spiritual technology that's been hidden from you. In the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, Greece, and the Near East, there was this understanding that true initiation, true awakening, required you to encounter your divine twin, your higher self, your immortal soul that exists beyond this physical incarnation. The Egyptian pharaohs were said to have a Ka, which was their spirit double, their divine twin. The Greeks called it the demon. Not demon, but a divine guiding spirit that was essentially your higher self. The Romans called it your genius. Every tradition understood that you're not just this physical body with this one lifetime personality. You're connected to something greater, something eternal, and awakening means recognizing and integrating with this higher aspect of yourself. What if Jesus and Thomas were demonstrating this physically? What if their twinness was a teaching tool showing that each of us has this divine twin, this Christ consciousness within us? And awakening means recognizing that you're not separate from this divine nature. You are it. You're twinned with it. You're one with it. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition talks about tulpas and nirmanakya, which are manifestations of enlightened consciousness that can appear in multiple forms simultaneously. A fully awakened master, according to this teaching, can project multiple bodies, multiple forms, to teach different students in different places at the same time. What if Jesus reached this level of consciousness? What if Thomas wasn't his biological twin, but a conscious projection? Another body inhabited by the same awakened consciousness? Or what if they were both biological beings who'd achieved such unity of consciousness that they functioned as one being in two bodies? This might sound far-fetched to Western minds conditioned by materialist thinking, but these concepts are foundational in Eastern spiritual traditions. And remember, Jesus spent those lost years somewhere, and the strongest evidence suggests he was in the East learning these very teachings. Let's look at what happened to Thomas after Jesus' death, because this is where the story gets even more deliberately obscured. According to tradition, Thomas traveled farther than any other apostle, going all the way to India, where he established Christian communities that still exist today and are among the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. The Mar Thoma Church and other Indian Christian communities have unbroken lineages going back to Thomas's arrival in 52 CE. And their teachings and practices are distinctly different from Roman Christianity. They incorporate meditation, they emphasize personal mystical experience, They have practices that look remarkably similar to Hindu and Buddhist techniques. Why? Because Thomas brought back the real teachings, the teachings he and Jesus had learned together, the practices they'd studied in the East. But here's the thing. These communities were geographically isolated from Rome, which means they were somewhat protected from the editing and control that Roman Christianity imposed everywhere else. They preserved teachings that were suppressed in the West, and even today, if you study the Indian Christian tradition, you'll find concepts and practices that the Catholic Church would consider heretical, but that align perfectly with the Gospel of Thomas and other excluded texts. Thomas was eventually martyred in India, speared to death according to tradition, and here's the haunting parallel. Both twins died violent deaths. Both were killed by authorities who feared their teachings. Both were silenced physically, but could never be silenced spiritually. And just as Jesus' death led to a transformation of his teachings into something he might not have recognized, Thomas's death led to the complete erasure of his true identity and role. He became Doubting Thomas, the weak one, the one who didn't have faith, when in reality he may have been the strongest one, the one who understood his twin brother's teachings so deeply that he carried them to the farthest reaches of the known world and died protecting them. The Church needed Thomas to be doubtful, to be lesser, to be erased as a true equal to Jesus. Because if Thomas was Jesus' twin and achieved similar levels of consciousness, then the specialness of Jesus, the uniqueness that justified the entire church power structure, would collapse. Now I want to address something that might be coming up for some of you watching this. You might be thinking, but I was raised Christian, I believe in Jesus. Does this mean everything I was taught is a lie? And here's what I want you to understand. The core teachings of Jesus, the actual words attributed to him about love, compassion, treating others as you want to be treated, the kingdom of heaven being within you, those teachings are real and powerful and transformative. What's been distorted is the power structure built around those teachings, the insistence that Jesus is the only way, the only truth, the only path, and that you must go through institutional religion to reach God. That distortion, that's the lie. That's what serves power, not spirit. Jesus himself, in the Gospel of Thomas, says, "The kingdom of heaven is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." This isn't worship me theology. This is know yourself theology. This is awakening to your own divine nature. And Thomas, his twin, his soul brother, understood this and taught this. And that's why he had to be erased, diminished, turned into a doubting figure rather than enlightened master in his own right. Let's talk about the practical implications of all this for your spiritual journey, because this isn't just ancient history. This is about your awakening right now. If Jesus and Thomas were twins, if they both achieved Christ consciousness, if they both accessed the same divine nature that lives within all of us, then what does that mean for you? It means that everything you've been told about needing to be saved, about being born in sin, about being fundamentally flawed and needing an external savior, that's programming designed to keep you spiritually dependent. The truth that Jesus and Thomas were demonstrating is that you have the same consciousness available to you that they accessed. You have the capacity to awaken, to transcend limitation, to know yourself as an eternal spiritual being having a temporary human experience. And the reason this was hidden from you, the reason Thomas had to be erased and Jesus had to be made into an unreachable deity, is because awakened humans are ungovernable, untrollable, unmanipulable. You can't control someone who knows their own divine nature. You can't frighten someone who understands that death is just a transition, You can't guilt someone who recognizes that they're already whole and perfect at their core. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt, where many believe both Jesus and Thomas studied during those lost years, taught that there are 7 levels of initiation, 7 stages of awakening, and the final stage was called becoming an Osiris, which meant achieving resurrection consciousness, understanding yourself as an eternal being who transcends death. The initiation chambers in the Great Pyramid, the rituals described in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The whole framework of Egyptian spirituality was about awakening to your eternal nature while still in a physical body. This wasn't about believing in something external. This was about experiencing your own immortality, your own divine consciousness directly. And this is what Jesus achieved, what Thomas achieved, what they taught others to achieve. But when Christianity became institutionalized, when it became a tool of empire, all of this direct experiential wisdom was stripped out and replaced with belief systems, with doctrines, with obedience to authority. Here's something that will really make you think. In almost every culture's mythology and spiritual teaching, there are stories of divine twins. Castor and Pollux in Greek mythology, Romulus and Remus in Roman mythology, the hero twins in Mayan mythology, the Ashvins in Hindu tradition. The twin archetype appears everywhere, and it always represents the same thing: duality coming into unity, the mortal and immortal aspects of self, the human and divine natures existing simultaneously. What if these weren't just myths? What if these were teaching stories preserving ancient knowledge about consciousness, about the twin nature of human existence? That you are both human and divine, both mortal and immortal, both physical and spiritual. Jesus and Thomas may have been the living embodiment of this teaching. 2 brothers, possibly twins, who both achieved awakening and demonstrated that the divine nature isn't rare or special or reserved for one person. It's the birthright of every soul courageous enough to do the inner work required to awaken to it. And speaking of that inner work, let's talk about what real spiritual awakening looks like, because the church hasn't just hidden the truth about Thomas. They've hidden the truth about the path to awakening. Real awakening isn't about believing the right things or going to church every Sunday or praying to an external God. Real awakening is about shadow work, about facing everything you've repressed and denied and hidden from yourself, about integrating all aspects of your being into wholeness. It's about meditation, about learning to quiet the endless mind chatter and access the deeper consciousness beneath it. It's about direct experience, about learning to have mystical experiences yourself rather than relying on someone else's experience from 2,000 years ago. It's about recognizing that every single person you meet is another expression of the same divine consciousness, which means there's no other. There's only the one consciousness experiencing itself from infinite different perspectives. Jesus taught this in the Gospel of Thomas when he said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." Meaning, we're drinking from the same source. We have access to the same consciousness. I'm not above you. We're equals in divine nature. The Hermetic teachings, another mystery school tradition that Jesus and Thomas may have studied, explicitly state, as above, so below, as within, so without, meaning that the divine nature you see in awakened masters is the same divine nature that exists within you. The macrocosm and microcosm are mirrors of each other. You contain the entire universe within your consciousness. And this is what they don't want you to know. Because if you knew this, if you really understood that you are a fractal holographic expression of divine consciousness with access to all wisdom, all power, all creative potential, you would stop giving your power away to institutions, to authorities, To anyone claiming to stand between you and the divine, you would recognize that the kingdom of heaven Jesus kept talking about isn't a place you go when you die if you've been good enough. It's a state of consciousness you can access right now in this very moment. Let me tell you about the Gnostic Christians, the ones who were hunted down and killed by the Orthodox Church, the ones whose texts were burned and whose teachings were called heresy. You know what they taught? They taught that gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine, was available to everyone. They taught that you could have your own direct relationship with God without needing priests or churches. They taught that the material world was created by a lesser deity called the demiurge, and that the true God, the highest divine source, was pure consciousness beyond form, and that awakening meant recognizing your own consciousness as part of that infinite divine consciousness. They taught that Jesus came not to die for your sins, but to wake you up, to show you the way to your own liberation, to demonstrate what's possible when a human fully realizes their divine nature. And guess which gospel the Gnostics treasured most highly? The Gospel of Thomas. The gospel that was excluded from the Bible. The gospel that makes the twin connection. The gospel that's all about personal awakening rather than external salvation. The Church Fathers labeled Gnosticism as the most dangerous heresy and systematically destroyed it, killing its practitioners, burning its texts, and replacing direct experiential spirituality with institutional religion that required your obedience and dependence. Now let's talk about something that might be the most mind-blowing aspect of all this. What if the second coming, that Christianity has been waiting for, isn't about Jesus returning as an external savior, but about the Christ consciousness awakening within humanity collectively? What if the prophecy is about us, about enough humans awakening to their own divine nature, that we create a critical mass shift in planetary consciousness? Think about it. Jesus repeatedly said, "You will do greater things than I have done." He said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." He said, "I and the Father are one," but also taught you and the Father are one too. He wasn't claiming to be special or unique. He was claiming to be awakened and showing you that the same awakening is available to you. And Thomas, his twin, his brother, his equal in consciousness, was teaching the same thing. They were both saying, "Wake up. Remember who you really are. Stop limiting yourself to this small human identity and recognize your infinite, eternal divine nature." But the church couldn't have that message spreading, so they elevated Jesus to unreachable deity status and erased Thomas from his true role, turning him into a doubting footnote rather than an awakened master. The Akashic records, which mystics describe as the energetic library of all consciousness and all events, supposedly contain the real history, the unedited version of what actually happened 2,000 years ago, and in all of human history. Psychics and mystics who've accessed these records consistently report that Jesus was part of a whole group of awakened teachers, that he studied in mystery schools, that he was married to Mary Magdalene, who was also an awakened master, that his mission was to spread teachings about human potential and divine consciousness, not to create a religion that would worship him. And in these accounts, Thomas features prominently not as a doubter, but as Jesus' closest companion, possibly his twin, definitely his spiritual equal, someone who understood the teachings so deeply that he carried them forward even after Jesus was crucified. But this true history has been suppressed, hidden, labeled as blasphemy, because it would completely undermine 2,000 years of religious power structures that depend on your spiritual dependency. Let me ask you something. Why do you think psychic abilities, mystical experiences, direct communion with the divine, all these natural human capacities, were labeled as witchcraft or demonic by the church? Why do you think practices like meditation, energy healing, astral projection, telepathy, all these abilities that every human has dormant within them, were suppressed and persecuted. Because these abilities prove that you don't need an intermediary to access spiritual realities. If you can have your own direct mystical experiences, if you can communicate with higher dimensional beings yourself, if you can access past life memories and understand your own soul's journey, if you can travel in consciousness beyond your body, then what do you need organized religion for? The Church throughout history has persecuted mystics, healers, seers, anyone who demonstrated direct access to spiritual truth, because these awakened individuals threatened the monopoly on spiritual authority that the Church claimed. And Jesus and Thomas were exactly this type of awakened mystic, which is why their true story had to be edited, controlled, and shaped into something that served institutional power rather than individual liberation. There's this concept in quantum physics, which is finally catching up to what ancient spiritual teachers knew all along, that consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality, that the observer affects the observed, that we're all connected in a unified field of consciousness, that what you call physical reality is actually a projection or hologram created by consciousness itself. Jesus understood this when he said, "If you have faith, you can move mountains." He wasn't talking about believing really hard in some external God. He was talking about understanding that consciousness creates reality and learning to consciously direct that creative power. When he walked on water, when he healed the sick, when he raised the dead, he was demonstrating mastery over the material world by understanding it as a projection of consciousness that can be manipulated by awakened consciousness. And Thomas, as his twin, as his equal in awakening, had these same abilities. But the Church couldn't let people know that these were natural abilities available to awakened humans. They had to make them seem like miracles that only Jesus could perform because he was God incarnate, special, unique, unreachable. But the truth is that these abilities are latent in your consciousness right now, waiting for you to awaken to them. Let's talk about the concept of the Christ for a moment, because this has been so misunderstood. Christ isn't Jesus' last name. It's a title, a state of consciousness. Christos means the anointed one, and it refers to someone who's achieved a particular level of awakening, someone who's been initiated into higher consciousness. In the mystery schools, becoming the Christ meant awakening to your divine nature, achieving what's sometimes called cosmic consciousness or unity consciousness, recognizing yourself as one with all that is. Jesus achieved this state. He became a Christ, but he wasn't the only Christ. He was one of many throughout history who've achieved this awakening. Buddha achieved it and called it enlightenment. Krishna achieved it. Lao Tzu achieved it. Mary Magdalene achieved it. And Thomas achieved it. They're all expressions of the same awakened state, the same realization of divine consciousness. The Church took this universal truth and twisted it into Jesus is the only way. But the real teaching is the way Jesus showed, the state he achieved, is available to all. You can become a Christ too. You can awaken to this same consciousness. And that's not blasphemy. That's the whole point of the teaching. Now I want to address something really important about why this knowledge is surfacing now. In this particular time in human history, we're living through a collective awakening, a shift in planetary consciousness that's been prophesied by indigenous cultures, ancient texts, and modern mystics alike. More and more people are waking up to the lies they've been told, questioning authority, seeking direct spiritual experience, having spontaneous mystical awakenings, remembering their true nature. The old control systems are crumbling because they can't contain awakening consciousness. And part of this awakening involves the truth coming out, hidden knowledge being revealed, suppressed histories being rediscovered. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 wasn't random. It was timed for this era of awakening. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, the increasing scholarship showing how much the Bible was edited and changed, the archaeological evidence contradicting official religious narratives. All of this is coming to light now because humanity is ready for it. Because enough souls have evolved to the point where they can handle the truth without their entire reality collapsing. You're watching this video right now because your soul is ready for this information, ready to release old programming and step into a more empowered understanding of who you really are. Think about what it would have meant for the early church if the twin connection between Jesus and Thomas had been widely known and accepted. It would have meant that the divine nature, the Christ consciousness, wasn't unique to one person, but was something that could be shared, inherited, accessed by others. It would have meant that Jesus' teachings weren't about worshiping him, but about following his example, doing the same work he did, achieving the same awakening he achieved. It would have meant that spiritual authority wasn't centralized in a church hierarchy, but was distributed to every awakened individual. It would have meant that you don't need to be saved because you're not fundamentally sinful or broken. You just need to wake up to what you already are. And that message would have made organized religion unnecessary. That message would have set people free rather than keeping them controlled. And that's why Thomas had to be erased, why his true identity and role had to be suppressed, why he became Doubting Thomas, instead of Thomas the Twin, who also achieved Christ consciousness. The church couldn't allow two Christs. They needed one to worship and control you with. Let me share something with you about the nature of truth that's really important to understand. Truth has a way of surviving even the most aggressive attempts to suppress it. It goes underground. It gets encoded in symbols and myths and stories. It gets preserved by secret societies and mystery schools. It waits patiently for the right time to resurface. The truth about Thomas has survived for 2,000 years despite systematic suppression. And it's resurfacing now in your consciousness, in the consciousness of everyone who's ready to hear it. You can't kill truth. You can only delay its revelation. And the truth is this: you are a divine being having a human experience. You have the same consciousness that Jesus and Thomas accessed. You have the capacity to awaken fully and live from your highest divine nature. And no institution, no authority, no power structure can take that away from you, because it's who you are at the deepest level of your being. The church tried to take this knowledge from you, but your soul remembers it. And that's why you're feeling something stirring inside you as you hear these words. Why something in you is recognizing this as true even if your conditioned mind is resisting it. So here's what I want you to do after watching this video. I want you to sit quietly and ask yourself, what if this is true? What if I really do have divine consciousness within me? What if awakening really is possible for me, not just for ancient masters from 2,000 years ago? And then I want you to notice what comes up. Notice the resistance, the fear, the voices saying that's blasphemy, or that's arrogant, or that's impossible. Those voices aren't your voice. They're the voice of conditioning, of programming, of 2,000 years of religious control systems trying to keep you small and dependent and disempowered. Beneath those voices, if you listen deeply enough, you'll hear another voice, quieter but more true. Your soul's voice saying, yes, I remember. I am that. I am divine. I am infinite. I am eternal. I am one with all that is. That voice, that's the real you. That's the consciousness that Jesus and Thomas were trying to wake up in everyone they encountered. That's the kingdom of heaven within you that they kept pointing to. The path of awakening isn't easy because it means releasing everything you've been conditioned to believe about yourself, about reality, about spirituality, about power and authority. It means standing in your own divine nature, even when the whole world tells you that's impossible or blasphemous or crazy. It means trusting your direct experience over dogma, your inner knowing over external authority, your soul's truth over society's lies. Jesus and Thomas both walked this path. Both faced persecution and death for teaching these truths. Both demonstrated what's possible when you fully commit to awakening regardless of the cost. And now it's your turn. You're being called to the same journey, the same transformation, the same realization of your infinite divine nature. Will you answer the call? Will you dare to question everything you've been taught? Will you have the courage to discover who you really are beneath all the conditioning and programming? Because that's what this is really about. Not just learning some hidden history about Jesus' twin brother, but recognizing that you are also a child of the divine, that you also have Christ consciousness within you. That retime stop writing the script and give me a outro utro so. What time is it where you are now? Has it shifted? Have you shifted? Because something has changed in you during this journey, hasn't it? You can feel it. That's your soul recognizing truth, remembering what it's always known. The erasure of Thomas wasn't just about hiding one man's story. It was about hiding your story, your potential, your divine nature. But here's the beautiful thing. They couldn't erase it completely. The truth survived. It waited, and now it's found you. If this message resonated with you, if something inside you awakened while watching this, then you're ready for more. There are deeper mysteries waiting, more hidden truths ready to be revealed. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're just getting started peeling back the layers of everything they've hidden from you. Drop a comment below telling me what shocked you most, what you're feeling right now, what questions are burning inside you. And remember, you're not here by accident. Your soul guided you to this moment because you're ready to wake up. The twin has been erased from history, but the truth can never be erased from your soul. Until next time, stay awakened, stay questioning, and remember, the kingdom of heaven is within you.